16, baby-discovered mother bear, was Forest's head of security against poachers. What she did was heroic. The forest had gone quiet that morning, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that made you nervous. It was different somehow, like the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something important to happen. Lily Morgan stood at the edge of her backyard, her small hands gripping the wooden fence that separated her family's property from the vast wilderness beyond. She'd lived here for all of her 7 years, and she'd never felt the forest calling to her quite like this. The usual morning sounds, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the distant crack of branches, had all faded into a soft, almost musical silence that seemed to pull her forward. Her father, Ethan Marshall, had left early that morning for his job at the ranger station, kissing her forehead and reminding her to stay close to the house while he was gone. Her mother was inside, busy with her morning routines, completely unaware that something extraordinary was unfolding just beyond their property line. Lily knew she shouldn't wander off, knew the rules about staying where adults could see her, but there was something in that silence that felt like an invitation written just for her. It wasn't scary or threatening. It was warm and welcoming, like the feeling you get when your grandmother opens her arms for a hug. She slipped through the gap in the fence, the one her father kept meaning to fix but never quite got around to. Her small feet made barely any sound on the carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves. The morning sun filtered through the canopy above, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the forest floor. As she walked deeper into the woods, following a path she'd never noticed before, the silence began to change. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something she couldn't quite name, something that made her heart beat a little faster with excitement rather than fear. That's when she saw her for the first time. The bear was massive, easily the largest living thing Lily had ever encountered, sitting in a small clearing about 20 feet away. Her dark fur caught the morning light, making it shimmer with hints of brown and gold. But it wasn't the bear's size that made Lily freeze in place, it was her eyes. They were looking directly at Lily, and in them was an intelligence, a knowing, that seemed almost human. The bear didn't move, didn't growl, didn't do any of the things Lily had been taught that bears do when they encounter humans. She just sat there, watching, waiting. Lily's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but somehow she wasn't afraid. There was something about the way the bear was looking at her, something gentle and protective, that made her feel safer than she'd ever felt before. Slowly, carefully, Lily took a step forward. The bear's ears twitched slightly, but she didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. It was as if they were having a conversation without words, each testing the other, each finding something unexpected. The bear's head turned slightly to the left, and Lily followed her gaze. There, arranged in what could only be described as a deliberate pattern, were 3 squirrels sitting on a fallen log. They weren't chattering or scampering about the way squirrels usually did. They were still, alert, their tiny eyes focused on the bear as if waiting for instructions. Above them, perched on various branches at different heights, were several birds, robins, blue jays, even a hawk, all silent, all watching the bear with the same intense focus. Lily looked back at the bear, and for a moment, she could have sworn the creature nodded at her. Not a big movement, just a slight dip of her massive head, but it was enough. Lily understood, though she couldn't have explained how or why, that she was being shown something special, something secret. The bear rose to her feet with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large, and began to walk deeper into the forest. She moved slowly, deliberately, and every few steps she would look back at Lily, as if making sure the little girl was following. And Lily did follow, her fear completely forgotten, replaced by a curiosity so strong it felt like a physical pull. As they walked, she began to notice things she'd never seen before, despite having played in these woods countless times. There were marks on certain trees, scratches that looked random at first, but began to form a pattern the more she looked at them. There were paths through the underbrush that seemed worn by regular use, but not by human feet. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there were animals watching them pass, not with fear or aggression, but with what looked like respect. The bear led her to another clearing, this one larger than the first, with a small stream running through it. The water was crystal clear, bubbling over smooth rocks with a sound that was almost like music. The bear sat down near the water's edge and looked at Lily, then at a spot beside her. The invitation was clear. Lily walked over and sat down, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from the bear's thick fur, but not quite touching. They sat there together, the giant bear and the small girl, watching the water flow. That's when the real magic began. A rabbit hopped into the clearing, not quickly like rabbits usually move, but with measured, deliberate hops. It stopped in front of the bear and made a series of small movements with its ears and nose. The bear watched intently, then turned her head toward a specific tree at the edge of the clearing. Immediately, a bird took flight from that tree, circling once before flying off in a particular direction. Within moments it returned, landing on a branch near the bear and chirping a specific pattern of notes. The bear's ear twitched, and she made a low, rumbling sound in her throat. Not a growl, but something softer, almost like a purr. Lily watched all of this with wide eyes, beginning to understand that she was witnessing some kind of communication, some kind of system that the animals used to talk to each other. And the bear seemed to be at the center of it all, like a conductor leading an orchestra. More animals began to appear. Deer stepping quietly into the clearing, more birds landing in the trees, even a fox sitting at a respectful distance. They all seemed to be reporting something to the bear, and she seemed to be giving them instructions in return. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and Lily lost track of time completely. She was mesmerized by this secret world she'd discovered, this hidden society of forest creatures working together in ways she'd never imagined possible. The bear, who Lily had started thinking of as Coda, though she didn't know why that name came to her, seemed to be teaching her, showing her how the forest really worked when humans weren't watching. At one point, Coda stood and walked to a particular tree, placing her paw on its trunk. She looked at Lily and made a soft huffing sound. Lily stood and walked over, placing her small hand next to the bear's massive paw. The bark was warm under her palm, and she could feel something, a vibration maybe, or just the sense of life flowing through the wood. Coda moved her paw up the trunk, and Lily saw what she was indicating, a series of scratches that formed a pattern, almost like a map. The bear moved to another tree and showed her different marks, then another and another. Each tree seemed to tell a story, to hold information that the animals could read and understand. Some marks were fresh, others old and grown over with new bark. Lily began to see that this was how they communicated over distances, how they left messages for each other. It was brilliant and simple, and completely invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. As the day wore on, Lily noticed that the animals' behavior began to change. They became more alert, more focused. Birds began flying in and out of the clearing more frequently, each one chirping specific patterns that seemed to mean something to Coda. The bear's posture changed too. She was still calm, but there was a tension in her muscles that hadn't been there before. She looked at Lily and made a gentle but firm gesture with her head, indicating that the girl should move behind a large boulder at the edge of the clearing. Lily didn't question it. She'd learned to trust Coda completely over the hours they'd spent together. She moved behind the boulder, but positioned herself so she could still see what was happening. Coda moved to the center of the clearing and sat up on her haunches, her impressive height making her look even more commanding. The other animals arranged themselves around her in what looked like strategic positions. Birds in the trees at various heights, rabbits and squirrels in the underbrush, the fox disappearing entirely into the shadows. Then Lily heard it. Voices, human voices, coming from the direction of the old logging road that ran through the eastern part of the forest. They were still distant, but getting closer. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but something about their tone made her stomach feel funny. These weren't hikers or nature lovers. There was something wrong about the way they were moving through the forest, something that made all the animals tense up. Coda remained perfectly still, but Lily could see her eyes tracking something in the distance. A blue jay flew down and landed near the bear's ear, chirping rapidly. Coda's head turned slightly, and she made a series of low sounds that Lily felt more than heard. Immediately, the forest around them came alive with subtle movement. Animals were repositioning themselves, but so quietly and carefully that if Lily hadn't been watching for it, she never would have noticed. The voices got closer, and now Lily could make out some words. Two men were talking about tracks they'd found, about rumors they'd heard. They mentioned things that made Lily's blood run cold: traps, weapons, prices for pelts, and other things she didn't want to think about. These were poachers, the kind of people her father had warned her about, the kind who came into the forest to hurt and take rather than to appreciate and protect. But Coda didn't seem afraid. If anything, she seemed ready. Like this was something she'd dealt with before, something she'd been preparing for. She made another low sound, and a deer stepped out of the trees on the far side of the clearing, visible for just a moment before disappearing again. It was moving in the direction of the voices, but not directly toward them, more like it was going to cross their path at an angle. Lily heard one of the men shout with excitement. They'd seen the deer. The sound of their footsteps changed direction, following where the deer had gone. But Lily could see what they couldn't. The deer was leading them away from the clearing, away from where all the animals were gathered. And it wasn't running in panic. It was moving deliberately, staying just visible enough to keep the men interested, but not close enough for them to do anything about it. More birds took flight, their calls creating a cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The men's voices became confused, frustrated. They were trying to figure out which direction to go, which sounds to follow. Every time they seemed to settle on a direction, something would happen to make them second-guess themselves. A branch cracking in the opposite direction, a flash of movement in their peripheral vision, a bird call that suggested prey in another area entirely. Lily watched in amazement as the forest itself seemed to be conspiring against the intruders. It wasn't aggressive or violent. It was more like the way her mother would distract her little brother when he was heading toward something dangerous, redirecting his attention over and over until he forgot what he'd been after in the first place. The animals were working together with a coordination that seemed impossible, each playing their part in an elaborate performance designed to confuse and misdirect. Coda remained at the center of it all, occasionally making small sounds or gestures that seemed to adjust the strategy in real time. When one of the men started heading back toward the clearing, a family of rabbits suddenly burst from the underbrush in the opposite direction, making enough noise to draw his attention away. When the other man pulled out what looked like a map, a gust of wind, that Lily could have sworn wasn't natural, blew it right out of his hands and into a thorny bush. The dance went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes. The men grew increasingly frustrated, their voices getting angrier, their movements more erratic. They were being turned around so gradually, so skillfully, that they didn't even realize they were now heading back the way they'd come. Every attempt to go deeper into the forest was met with another distraction, another false lead, another moment of confusion. Finally, Lily heard one of them say they should give up for the day, that something wasn't right about these woods. The other agreed, muttering about wasted time and weird animals. Their voices began to fade as they retreated, and Lily could hear them stumbling and cursing as they made their way back to the logging road. Even their exit was being managed. Branches seemed to catch at their clothes. Roots seemed to appear under their feet. And more than once Lily heard the sound of someone tripping and falling. Only when the voices had completely faded did Coda relax her vigilant posture. She turned to look at Lily, and in her eyes was something that looked almost like pride. Not in herself, but in her forest, in the system she'd helped create and maintain. The other animals began to disperse, but not in a rushed way. Some stopped by Coda first, as if checking in or receiving final instructions. The deer that had led the men away returned, unharmed and calm, and touched its nose briefly to Coda's paw before bounding away. Lily came out from behind the boulder, her mind spinning with everything she'd witnessed. She walked up to Coda, and without thinking about it, wrapped her small arms around the bear's massive neck. Coda allowed it, even seemed to lean into the hug slightly, her fur warm and soft against Lily's cheek. They stayed like that for a moment, the little girl and the guardian bear, sharing a moment of connection that transcended species and spoke to something deeper. When Lily finally pulled away, she saw that the sun was starting to get low in the sky. She'd been gone for hours, and her mother would be worried. Coda seemed to understand this too. She stood and began walking back the way they'd come, but slowly, making sure Lily could keep up. As they walked, Lily noticed that other animals were following them. Not obviously, but she could sense them in the trees and bushes, making sure she got home safely. The journey back seemed shorter than the journey out, as if the forest was helping her along, making sure she got home before anyone really started to panic. When they reached the spot where Lily had first seen Coda, the bear stopped. She looked down at Lily with those intelligent eyes, and Lily understood that this was as far as Coda would go. The bear leaned down and very gently touched her nose to Lily's forehead, a gesture that felt like both a blessing and a promise. Then Coda did something that Lily would remember for the rest of her life. She raised one massive paw and placed it against her chest, right over her heart. Then she pointed that same paw at Lily, then swept it around to indicate the forest, then brought it back to her heart. The message was clear. Lily was part of this now, part of the forest's secret, part of Coda's protected world. It was a trust being given, a responsibility being shared, and an honor being bestowed all at once. Lily nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of what she was being told. She was too young to fully grasp all the implications, but she knew that she'd been shown something precious and secret, something that needed to be protected. She placed her own small hand over her heart, then pointed to Coda, then to the forest, mirroring the bear's gesture. Coda's eyes seemed to sparkle with something that looked like approval, maybe even affection. The bear turned and began walking back into the forest, but she stopped once and looked back. In that look was a promise. They would see each other again. Then she disappeared into the trees, melting into the shadows as if she'd never been there at all. Lily stood there for a moment longer, then turned and ran back toward her house, her heart full of wonder and her mind full of secrets she didn't yet have words to express. As she squeezed back through the gap in the fence, she saw her mother, Jessica Brooks, standing on the back porch, just starting to look concerned. "There you are, sweetheart," her mother called out. "I was beginning to wonder where you'd wandered off to. Were you playing in the yard?" Lily nodded, not trusting herself to speak just yet. How could she possibly explain what had just happened? How could she tell anyone about Coda and the secret network of animals protecting the forest? Who would believe her? And more importantly, she understood somehow that this secret wasn't hers to tell. It had been shared with her in trust, and that trust was sacred. That night, as her father tucked her into bed, he noticed something different about his daughter. She seemed older somehow, more thoughtful. "You okay, little one?" he asked, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "You've been quiet tonight." Lily looked up at him with serious eyes. "Daddy, the forest is special, isn't it? Like, really special?" Ethan smiled, thinking she was just beginning to appreciate the natural world around them. "Yes, sweetheart, it is. That's why we have to protect it." "Some are already protecting it," Lily said softly, her eyes growing heavy with sleep. "Better than we know." Her father looked at her curiously, but she was already drifting off. Her dreams full of wise bears and brave animals, and a forest that knew how to take care of itself. Outside her window, if anyone had been watching, they might have seen a large shadow at the edge of the tree line, standing guard for just a moment before disappearing back into the darkness. The next morning, Lily woke with the sun streaming through her window and the sound of birds singing in the trees. But now she heard something different in their songs. Patterns, messages, a whole conversation happening right outside her window that she was just beginning to understand. She got dressed quickly and ran to the kitchen, where her mother was making breakfast. "Can I eat outside?" she asked, grabbing a piece of toast. Her mother laughed. "You really love that backyard, don't you?" "Sure, but stay where I can see you." Lily took her toast and went out to sit on the porch steps. As she ate, she watched the tree line, and she could have sworn she saw movement in the shadows. Not threatening movement, but watchful, protective. A squirrel ran along the fence, stopping to look at her for a moment before continuing on its way. But in that brief pause, Lily saw something in its eyes. Recognition, acknowledgement, acceptance. She was part of something now, something bigger than herself. Something ancient and wise and wonderful. The forest had its own way of dealing with threats, its own system of protection that had probably existed long before humans ever thought they were in charge. And at the center of it all was Coda, the gentle giant who coordinated the defense with a wisdom that seemed almost magical. Over the next few days, Lily found herself spending more and more time at the edge of the yard, watching and learning. She began to recognize individual animals. The blue jay, with the slightly crooked tail feather, who seemed to be one of Coda's main scouts. The rabbit, with the white spot on its ear, who often appeared just before something important happened. The fox, who was so good at staying hidden that Lily only ever saw glimpses of red fur and bright eyes. She started to understand their patterns, too. Early morning was for reporting. Animals would move through the forest, in what looked like random wandering, but was actually a careful survey of their territory. Midday was quieter, a time for rest and watchfulness. Evening brought another flurry of activity as the day shift handed over to the night shift, because Lily had realized that the protection never stopped. There were always eyes watching, always ears listening, always someone ready to sound the alarm if needed. Her parents noticed her new fascination with wildlife and encouraged it, buying her books about animals and their behaviors. But nothing in those books mentioned what Lily was seeing. They talked about instinct and territory and survival, but they didn't talk about cooperation between species, about organized resistance to threats, about the kind of intelligence and planning she witnessed every day. One afternoon, about a week after her first encounter with Coda, Lily was sitting in her usual spot when she heard voices again. Different voices this time, but with the same wrong feeling about them. She tensed, ready to run inside and tell her father, but then she saw the squirrel with the white-eared rabbit. They were already on it, already spreading the word through their network. She watched, fascinated, as the forest's defense system activated once again. It was different this time. The intruders were coming from a different direction, and they seemed more prepared, more determined. But Coda's network adapted instantly. Birds created false trails of sound, leading away from where the animals actually were. Deer showed themselves just long enough to be seen, then vanished in directions that led nowhere. Even the wind seemed to cooperate, carrying scents that confused and misdirected. This time, Lily could see Coda in the distance, positioned on a small rise where she could oversee everything. The bear was magnificent in her role as protector, calm and confident and completely in control. She didn't need to chase or fight or attack. She just needed to coordinate, to guide, to ensure that the forest itself became an impossible maze for those who meant it harm. The intruders lasted less than an hour before giving up, frustrated by their complete inability to find anything worth their time. As they retreated, Lily heard one of them say something that made her smile. "This place is cursed or something. Animals here don't act right." If only they knew how right they were, though cursed was entirely the wrong word. Blessed was more like it. Blessed with a protector who used intelligence instead of violence, cooperation instead of confrontation. As the weeks turned into months, Lily's understanding of the forest's secret deepened. She learned that Coda wasn't just protecting the animals from poachers. She was maintaining a balance, ensuring that the ecosystem thrived. When a diseased tree threatened to infect others, somehow the right woodpeckers would show up to remove the infected bark. When an area became overgrazed, the deer would mysteriously avoid it until it recovered. When a stream started to become polluted from runoff, the beavers would build dams that filtered the water. It was like watching a master gardener tend to their garden, if the gardener was a bear and the garden was an entire forest. Everything was connected. Everything had a purpose, and Coda seemed to understand it all instinctively. Or maybe not instinctively. Maybe this knowledge had been passed down from mother to daughter for generations, a sacred duty that certain bears took on to protect their homes. Lily started leaving little offerings at the edge of the forest. An apple here, some berries there, always placed carefully on a flat stone she'd found. She never saw who took them, but they were always gone by the next morning, and sometimes there would be something left in return. A pretty feather, an interesting rock, once a handful of the sweetest wild strawberries she'd ever tasted. Her father noticed the exchanges one day and asked her about it. "Are you feeding the wildlife, sweetheart? You know we're not supposed to do that." Lily thought carefully about her answer. "I'm not feeding them, Daddy. I'm trading with them, like friends do." Ethan looked at his daughter with a mixture of amusement and concern. "Friends? The forest is friendly, if you're friendly to it," Lily said simply. "It takes care of us, so we should take care of it too." Her father couldn't argue with that logic, though he wondered where his 7-year-old had developed such a sophisticated understanding of reciprocity with nature. If he'd known the truth, that his daughter was learning from a bear who ran the most effective anti-poaching network in the state, he probably wouldn't have believed it anyway. One day, Lily arrived at her watching spot to find something different. There was a tension in the air, a nervousness among the animals that she'd never felt before. The birds were flying in agitated patterns. The squirrels were chattering more than usual, and even the usually calm deer seemed skittish. Something was wrong, something bigger than the usual intrusions. Then she saw Coda. and for the first time, the bear looked worried. She was standing at the forest edge, closer to Lily's house than she'd ever come before, and she was looking directly at Lily with an urgency that was impossible to misunderstand. Lily didn't hesitate. She slipped through the fence and ran to the bear, who immediately turned and began moving quickly through the forest. They traveled faster than ever before, Coda occasionally stopping to make sure Lily was keeping up, but clearly in a hurry to get somewhere. Other animals joined them as they moved, the fox running alongside, birds flying overhead, even a family of raccoons scrambling through the branches above. It was like the entire forest was mobilizing for something. They arrived at a clearing Lily had never seen before, and what she saw there made her gasp. There was another bear, smaller than Coda, lying on its side and breathing heavily. It was injured, a deep gash along its flank that was bleeding steadily. Around it were cubs, 3 of them, mewling pitifully and pressing against their mother's still form. Coda made a low, mournful sound and approached the injured bear slowly. They touched noses briefly, and Lily could see the communication passing between them. Not in words, but in something deeper, more primal. The injured bear's eyes found Lily, and there was a plea in them that broke the little girl's heart. Without thinking, Lily pulled off her jacket and moved toward the wound. Her mother had taught her basic first aid, and while this was way beyond anything a Band-Aid could fix, she could at least try to stop the bleeding. She pressed her jacket against the wound, applying pressure like she'd been taught. The injured bear flinched but didn't move away, seeming to understand that this small human was trying to help. "We need help," Lily said to Coda, her voice shaking. "Real help. A vet or my dad. My dad knows people who can help." Coda looked at her for a long moment, and Lily could see the struggle in her eyes. Bringing humans here would mean revealing their secret, risking everything they'd worked to protect. But the alternative was letting this mother bear die, leaving these cubs orphaned. Finally, Coda nodded, a decisive movement that sent the other animals into action. The fox took off running in the direction of Lily's house, and several birds followed. Coda moved to support the injured bear's head, keeping her as comfortable as possible, while Lily maintained pressure on the wound. "It's going to be okay," Lily whispered, not sure if she was talking to the injured bear, the cubs, Coda, or herself. "Help is coming. Just hold on." The cubs had gathered around Lily now, their small bodies pressed against her, as if seeking comfort from this strange, small creature who was trying to save their mother. One of them, braver than the others, actually climbed into her lap, its weight warm and surprisingly heavy. Lily kept one hand on the wound and used the other to stroke the cub's fur, trying to provide what comfort she could. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Every second felt like an hour, but somehow, impossibly soon, she heard voices, human voices calling her name. Her father's voice, full of panic and fear. "Lily! Lily, where are you?" "Here," she called back, her voice cracking. "Daddy, here, please hurry." The crashing through the underbrush got louder, and then her father burst into the clearing, followed by 2 other rangers she recognized from the station. They all stopped dead at the sight before them. Lily, covered in blood, surrounded by bears, her small hands trying to save a life that was far too large for her to hold. "Nobody move," one of the rangers whispered, his hand going to his radio. "No," Lily said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "They won't hurt us. They need our help. Please, Daddy, she's dying. The cubs." Ethan looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw something in her eyes that made him pause. This wasn't a child who had stumbled into danger. This was a child who had been called to help, who was exactly where she needed to be. He made a decision that went against all his training but felt completely right. "Radio for the wildlife vet," he told the other ranger. "Emergency evacuation for an injured bear. Tell them it's critical." The ranger looked at him like he'd lost his mind, but something about the scene, the way the large bear was cradling the injured one's head, the way the cubs were clinging to Lily, the way the entire forest seemed to be holding its breath, made him comply. What followed was controlled chaos. The vet arrived with a team, and they worked on the injured bear right there in the clearing. Coda never moved from her position, her presence keeping the injured bear calm. The cubs stayed with Lily, who held them and whispered soothing words while their mother was treated. The other animals maintained a respectful distance, but never left, creating a circle of witnesses to this unprecedented cooperation between humans and wildlife. The vet, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, worked with incredible skill and efficiency. She cleaned and sutured the wound, administered antibiotics and pain medication, and set up an IV for fluids. Through it all, she kept shooting amazed glances at the scene around her. The protective circle of animals, the child covered in blood but completely unafraid, the massive bear, who seemed to be overseeing everything with an intelligence that should have been impossible. "She's going to make it," Dr. Chen finally announced, sitting back on her heels with exhaustion. "But she needs rest and continued care. We should transport her to—" Coda made a sound, not threatening but firm, and shook her massive head. The message was clear. The injured bear would stay here in the forest with her family. "We can't just leave her here," one of the rangers protested. "She needs medical supervision." Lily stood up, still holding one of the cubs. "They'll take care of her," she said with complete confidence. "They take care of each other. We just needed to help with what they couldn't do themselves." Her father looked at her with a mixture of wonder and confusion. "Lily, how do you—" But before he could finish the question, Coda moved. She walked over to Ethan, this massive predator approaching a human with no aggression whatsoever, and did something that made everyone gasp. She bowed, a clear, deliberate lowering of her head, in what could only be interpreted as gratitude. Then she straightened and looked him directly in the eyes, and in that gaze was a message as clear as any words. "Thank you for saving my sister. Your daughter is under my protection, always." Ethan, moving on instinct rather than thought, bowed back. The clearing was silent for a moment, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone present. They had just witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about wildlife, about intelligence, about the relationship between humans and nature. Dr. Chen broke the silence. "I'll leave supplies," she said quietly. "Antibiotics, pain medication, bandages, if someone knew how to use them, the bear could recover here." She looked at Coda as she said it, and the bear's slow blink seemed like agreement. Working quickly, Dr. Chen prepared a kit with everything needed for continued care, demonstrating on the sedated bear how to change bandages and administer medication. It was surreal, teaching first aid to a forest full of animals, but somehow it felt like the right thing to do. As the sun began to set, casting golden light through the trees, the humans prepared to leave. The injured bear was stable, sleeping peacefully with her cubs curled against her. Coda had positioned herself as a guardian, clearly planning to stay the night. The other animals had relaxed but remained present, their vigil continuing. Lily didn't want to leave, but she knew she had to. She carefully placed the cub she'd been holding back with its siblings and stood up. Her clothes were ruined, covered in blood and dirt, but she'd never felt more proud of anything in her life. She walked over to Coda and without hesitation hugged the massive bear again. "I'll come back tomorrow," she whispered, "to check on her." Coda rumbled softly, a sound that Lily had learned meant agreement and affection. Then the bear did something she'd never done before. She walked with them as they left, accompanying the group of humans all the way to the edge of the forest. It was a gesture of trust and respect that left all the adults speechless. As they emerged from the trees, Ethan finally found his voice. "Lily, we need to talk about what just happened." Lily nodded, knowing that her secret was no longer just hers, but looking at the faces around her, her father, the other rangers, Dr. Chen, she saw wonder rather than fear, awe rather than disbelief. They had all been changed by what they'd witnessed, had all become part of something larger than themselves. "The forest has been protecting itself," Lily said simply. "Coda makes sure of it. She keeps everyone safe from the bad people who want to hurt the animals. She's been doing it for a long time, and she's really, really good at it." The adults exchanged glances, processing this information. One of the rangers, a man named Tom, spoke up. "Those poaching reports that suddenly stopped a few years ago, the ones where the poachers claimed the forest was haunted or cursed—" "Not haunted," Lily corrected. "Protected. Coda and her network make sure the bad people never find what they're looking for. They get confused and turned around and frustrated until they give up and leave." "Network?" Dr. Chen asked, her scientific mind fully engaged. Lily nodded enthusiastically. "All the animals work together. The birds are scouts, the deer create false trails, the squirrels are messengers. Even the fox helps, and foxes don't usually work with anyone. But Coda brings them all together. She's like a forest guardian," Ethan finished softly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "A protector who uses intelligence and cooperation instead of violence." "Exactly," Lily beamed at her father. "And now we're part of it too, aren't we? We helped when they needed us, so we're part of the network now." The implications of this were staggering. If what Lily was saying was true, and after what they'd all witnessed, how could they doubt it? Then they had discovered something unprecedented. Not just animal intelligence, but organized animal resistance to human threats, coordinated protection of their ecosystem that went far beyond anything in the scientific literature. "We can't tell anyone about this," Tom said suddenly. "If word got out, scientists would descend on this place. Media would turn it into a circus. The very thing they're protecting against would happen." Dr. Chen nodded in agreement. "The bears, the whole network, they've shown us incredible trust. We can't betray that." And so, standing there at the edge of the forest, as the sun set behind the trees, a pact was made. The humans who had witnessed the miracle would keep the secret, would become part of the protection rather than the threat. They would be silent guardians of the guardians, ensuring that Coda and her network could continue their work undisturbed. The morning after the rescue carried a different quality of light, as if the sun itself knew that something had fundamentally changed in the relationship between the forest and the small group of humans who now held its secret. Lily woke before dawn, her mind immediately returning to the injured mother bear and her cubs. She dressed quietly, trying not to wake her parents, but found her father already in the kitchen, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands and a thoughtful expression on his face. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked softly, and Lily shook her head. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment before Ethan spoke again. "I've been thinking about what you showed us yesterday, about Coda and everything. How long have you known?" Lily climbed onto the stool beside him, accepting the glass of orange juice he poured for her. "Since the beginning of summer, but Daddy, I think it's been happening for much, much longer than that. Coda isn't the first one to do this job." I think she learned it from her mother, and her mother learned it from her mother before that. Her father absorbed this information, his ranger's mind recalculating everything he thought he knew about the forest he'd sworn to protect. The old stories the indigenous people used to tell about guardian spirits in these woods, maybe they weren't just stories. Maybe they were trying to tell us something true in the only way people would listen, Lily suggested, wise beyond her years. Sometimes the truth is so amazing that you have to wrap it in a story for anyone to believe it. They finished their breakfast and prepared to return to the forest, this time with supplies Dr. Chen had left for the injured bear's continued care. Jessica had been told a version of the truth, that Lily had helped with an injured animal and needed to check on it, but the full magnitude of the secret remained with those who had witnessed it firsthand. As they walked toward the forest edge, Lily noticed something different. The usual morning bird song had a new quality to it, almost like a greeting, and she realized with a start that the animals were acknowledging them as friends rather than potential threats. The fox appeared first, materializing from the underbrush with its distinctive rust-colored coat catching the early morning light. It looked at them for a moment, then turned and began walking into the forest, clearly expecting them to follow. Ethan and Lily exchanged glances and did just that, trusting this wild creature to guide them through paths that seemed to shift and change with each visit, as if the forest itself was a living maze that could reconfigure itself at will. They found the clearing transformed into something resembling a forest hospital. The injured mother bear was awake, but resting comfortably, her cubs nursing while she dozed. Coda sat nearby, alert and watchful, but her posture relaxed when she saw Lily and her father approach. Around the clearing, other animals had taken up positions, some keeping watch, others bringing offerings of food, a few simply present as if providing emotional support to their injured neighbor. Dr. Chen was already there, having arrived even earlier to check on her patient. She looked up as they approached, her face showing a mixture of professional satisfaction and continued amazement. "The wound is healing remarkably well," she reported. "Better than I would have expected, honestly. It's as if—" She paused, searching for words. "As if the forest itself is helping her heal." Lily knelt beside the injured bear, who opened one eye to regard her with what looked like gratitude. The cubs recognized her immediately, tumbling over each other in their eagerness to reach the small human who had helped save their mother. One particularly bold cub climbed into her lap and promptly fell asleep, trusting her completely. The mother bear made a soft huffing sound that Lily had learned meant approval, and closed her eye again, content that her babies were safe. "She needs a name," Lily announced suddenly. "We can't just keep calling her the injured bear, I think. I think her name should be Hope, because she gave us hope that humans and animals can work together." Coda made that rumbling sound of approval, and somehow that settled it. Hope it was. As the morning progressed, they fell into a routine that felt both surreal and perfectly natural. Dr. Sao's Hai Chen showed Lily and her father how to properly clean and redress the wound, though it became clear that Coda had been watching intently and understood the process perfectly. When they prepared the antibiotics, Coda actually helped by gently holding Hope's head still, displaying a level of understanding that should have been impossible. But that was when things took an unexpected turn. They heard them before they saw them. Voices, multiple voices, and the sound of vehicles where no vehicles should be. Ethan's radio crackled to life with a message from the ranger station. A group of men had been spotted entering the forest from the old logging road, heavily armed and clearly not there for a nature walk. These weren't the usual bumbling poachers that Coda's network regularly confused and redirected. These were professionals, organized and determined, The change in the forest was immediate and dramatic. Every animal in the clearing went on high alert, and Coda rose to her full height, her eyes scanning the trees with an intensity that was almost frightening. Birds began arriving from all directions, each one chirping urgent messages that Coda seemed to understand perfectly. The fox disappeared and reappeared moments later, clearly agitated, running back and forth between Coda and the edge of the clearing as if relaying information. "They're coming this way," Ethan said, reading the signs as clearly as any of the animals. "We need to move Hope and the cubs." But Hope couldn't be moved, not without risking reopening her wound. She tried to stand but stumbled, still too weak from blood loss and medication. The cubs sensed their mother's distress and began crying, their small voices carrying further than anyone would have liked. Coda made a decision then, a sound that was almost like a roar, but not quite, something that carried through the forest like a wave. What happened next was something Lily would remember for the rest of her life. The forest came alive in a way she'd never seen before, not even during the previous diversions she'd witnessed. This wasn't just misdirection. This was active protection. Trees that had stood still for decades suddenly seemed to creak and groan, branches falling across paths with suspicious accuracy. The underbrush became thicker, more tangled, as if plants were literally growing faster to create barriers. A massive oak tree near the edge of the clearing, one that had looked perfectly healthy moments before, suddenly split with a sound like thunder, falling directly across the main path the intruders would have to take. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Lily looked at Coda and saw the bear's eyes focused on that very tree, as if she had somehow known exactly when and how it would fall. "That's impossible," Dr. Chen whispered. But they were all learning that impossible was a relative term in this forest. The voices were getting closer, but they were also getting more frustrated. The men were finding their path blocked at every turn, their equipment tangling in vines that shouldn't have been there, their boots sinking into mud that had been solid ground moments before. One of them could be heard complaining about his GPS malfunctioning, showing them walking in circles when they were certain they'd been going straight. But these men were persistent, and eventually, inevitably, they found their way closer to the clearing. Lily could see them now through the trees. 5 men, all carrying weapons, all with the hard look of people who had done this before and would do it again. They were different from the casual poachers, more dangerous, more determined. The one in front, who seemed to be the leader, had a scarred face and cold eyes that made Lily shiver. "Well, well," the scarred man said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Looks like we found ourselves a little gathering. And what do we have here? Rangers playing veterinarian to the very bears we've been hired to relocate?" The way he said relocate made it clear that wasn't what he meant at all. These weren't poachers looking for a quick profit. These were hired killers, brought in to eliminate what someone saw as a problem bear population. Lily felt her father tense beside her, his hand moving to his radio, but the scarred man noticed. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Ranger. We have every legal right to be here. Proper permits and everything. Problem bear removal, all perfectly legitimate. Though, I have to say, interfering with authorized wildlife management could cost you your job." "There are no problem bears here," Ethan said firmly, stepping forward to put himself between the men and the clearing. "These animals have never attacked anyone, never damaged property. There's no justification for what you're planning to do." The scarred man smiled, an expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, but there is. See, some very important people want to develop this land, and bears make investors nervous. Much easier to remove the bears now, claim they were a danger than to fight environmental protections later. It was worse than simple poaching. It was systematic extermination disguised as wildlife management. Lily felt sick to her stomach, but also angry, a fierce protective rage that surprised her with its intensity. These men were threatening her friends, her family, because that's what Coda and Hope and all the others had become. They were family. That's when Coda did something unexpected. She walked forward, past Ethan, past all human protection, and stood directly in the path of the armed men. She didn't growl, didn't rear up, didn't make any aggressive moves at all. She just stood there, massive and immovable, her eyes locked on the scarred man's face. It was a challenge, but also something more. A test of his humanity, perhaps, or a final chance to choose a different path. The scarred man raised his weapon, and time seemed to slow down. Lily heard herself scream, "No!" and start running forward, her father's hands reaching for her but missing. But before anyone could fire, before violence could erupt, something extraordinary happened. The forest itself seemed to respond to the threat against its guardian. Every bird in the canopy took flight at once, thousands of them, creating a whirlwind of wings and cries that was overwhelming in its intensity. They didn't attack the men, but they flew around them in a tornado of feathers and sound that made it impossible to see or aim. Squirrels dropped from the trees, not attacking, but running across boots and up legs, causing the men to dance and stumble. Deer burst from the underbrush, leaping between the men and their targets, a living shield of brown fur and white tails. And through it all, Coda stood perfectly still, waiting. The message was clear. The forest would protect its protector, and these men were vastly outnumbered. But it was what happened next that truly changed everything. From the opposite side of the clearing, drawn by the commotion, came other humans. Tom and 3 other rangers, Dr. Chen with 2 colleagues, and most surprisingly, a group of people with cameras and recording equipment. Logan Carter, Michael Hayes, one of the newcomers called out, and Lily recognized the names. These were the 2 poachers who had been turned away weeks ago. But now they were back, and they were carrying cameras instead of weapons. We're with the documentary crew from Wildlife Protection International. We've been recording everything, including your admission of planned illegal bear killing under false permits. The scarred man's face went pale. He lowered his weapon, calculating rapidly. The situation had changed completely. There were too many witnesses, too much evidence. Whatever fake permits he had wouldn't stand up to scrutiny, not with video evidence of his real intentions. He made a gesture to his men, and they began backing away, but Logan Carter stepped forward. "You don't understand what you're protecting here," he said, and his voice was different now, filled with awe rather than greed. "These aren't just bears. This forest, it's alive in ways that shouldn't be possible. We came back to document it, to show the world that there's something here worth preserving." Michael Hayes nodded, adding, "We were wrong before, when we came here to hunt. The forest showed us mercy we didn't deserve. It could have hurt us, but instead it just redirected us, confused us, sent us away unharmed. That kind of intelligence, that kind of restraint, it needs to be protected, not destroyed." The transformation of the 2 former poachers into protectors was remarkable, but Lily understood it. The forest had that effect on people, once they truly saw it for what it was. Even the scarred man seemed affected, his cold eyes showing a flicker of uncertainty as he looked around at the impossible scene. A bear being treated by veterinarians, animals working together across species lines, a forest that seemed to respond to threats with coordinated defense. "This is insane," he muttered, but he was already backing away. "All of this is insane." "No," Lily said, finding her voice and stepping forward. "It's not insane. It's just nature being smarter than we thought it could be. It's animals protecting their home the same way we would protect ours. And if you try to hurt them again, you won't just be fighting bears or birds or deer. You'll be fighting all of us." She gestured around the clearing, at the rangers, the veterinarians, the documentary crew, and all the animals still watching from the trees. It was a coalition that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist according to everything humans thought they knew about the world. But there it was, proof that the lines between human and animal, protector and protected, were far more blurred than anyone had imagined. The scarred man and his team left then, moving quickly through the forest that seemed eager to speed their departure. Branches that had blocked their way coming in suddenly cleared, paths that had been muddy became firm, and their equipment that had been tangled came free easily. The forest wanted them gone, and it was making their exit as smooth as possible to ensure they didn't linger. As the sound of their vehicles faded into the distance, a collective sigh seemed to run through the clearing. The birds settled back into the trees, the deer melted back into the forest, and the squirrels returned to their normal chattering. But something had changed, something fundamental. The secret was no longer quite so secret, but perhaps that was okay. Perhaps it was time for the world to know that nature had its own ways of protecting itself, ways that humans could learn from if they were willing to listen. Logan Carter approached Coda slowly, respectfully, his camera hanging loose at his side. "We won't film you without permission," he said to the bear, and though the words should have been ridiculous, they felt entirely appropriate. "But if you'll let us, we'd like to tell your story, not the details, not the secrets, but enough to make people understand that this forest is special and needs to be protected." Coda looked at him for a long moment, then turned to look at Lily. The little girl understood that she was being asked for her opinion, that somehow she had become the bridge between these two worlds. She thought carefully before answering. "You can tell them that the forest knows how to take care of itself," she said finally. "You can tell them that animals are smarter than we think, that they work together in ways we don't understand. But you can't tell them about Coda specifically, or about Hope, or about any individual animal. They need to stay safe, to be able to do their work without people coming to stare or study them." Logan nodded, understanding the wisdom in the child's words. "We'll tell the story of a forest that defends itself, of cooperation between species that science can't explain yet. We'll make people want to protect it without making them want to invade it." And so began a new chapter in the forest's long history. The documentary crew worked with the rangers and veterinarians to create a story that was true without being complete, that showed enough to inspire protection without revealing so much that it would bring the wrong kind of attention. They filmed the forest's beauty, its complexity, the way different species interacted in subtle ways that suggested intelligence and planning. But they were careful never to film Coda directly, never to reveal the full extent of what they had witnessed. The bear remained a shadow in the background, a presence felt but not seen, a guardian whose identity remained secret. The story they told was of a forest that seemed to have its own immune system against threats, a natural resistance to those who would harm it that couldn't be fully explained, but couldn't be denied either. Hope recovered fully over the following weeks, her wound healing with remarkable speed. The day she was able to stand and walk properly again was a celebration, with even the usually stoic Coda showing visible relief and joy. The cubs had grown during their mother's recovery, becoming more adventurous and playful, often including Lily in their games when she visited. The relationship between the human protectors and the forest's own defense network evolved into something unique. The rangers began to notice patterns they'd overlooked before, understanding that certain animal behaviors were actually early warning signals. When the birds flew in particular formations, it meant strangers were approaching from specific directions. When the deer moved through certain areas at unusual times, it indicated potential problems that needed investigation. Dr. Chen established a discreet wildlife medical station at the ranger facility, ready to help when the forest's own healing abilities weren't enough. She never asked how injured animals seemed to know to come to her, appearing at the station's door at all hours with various ailments. She simply treated them and sent them back, knowing they were part of something larger than traditional veterinary practice. Lily continued to grow in her role as the bridge between worlds. She learned more of the forest's language, understanding not just the basic communications but the nuances, the subtle differences between a warning call and a greeting, between a request for help and an offer of assistance. Her parents watched with a mixture of pride and bewilderment as their daughter became something they had no words for. Not quite a ranger, not quite a scientist, but something older and more fundamental. One evening, as autumn began to paint the leaves in shades of gold and red, Lily sat in the clearing with Coda and Hope and the cubs, who were now nearly as large as their mother. The documentary had been released to critical acclaim, generating support for enhanced protection of the forest without revealing its deepest secrets. The development plans had been scrapped, the false wildlife management permits revoked, and a new understanding had emerged about the value of leaving some places wild and untouched. "You did it," Lily said to Coda, leaning against the bear's warm bulk. "You saved your forest." Coda rumbled softly and placed a massive paw gently on Lily's shoulder. But the gesture seemed to say something different. Not "I did it," but "we did it." Because that was the truth. It had taken all of them, bears and birds, humans and squirrels, foxes and deer, working together in ways that defied conventional wisdom about the natural world. As the sun set through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, other animals began to appear. They came quietly, respectfully, gathering in a large circle around Coda and Lily and Hope's family. It felt like a ceremony of sorts, an acknowledgement of what they had all accomplished together. The fox sat beside a rabbit without any sign of predator or prey, just two citizens of the same community. Birds of different species perched on the same branches, their usual territorial disputes set aside. And in the center of it all, a little girl and a mighty bear sat together in perfect contentment, proof that the barriers between species were constructs of limited understanding, rather than fundamental truths. The forest had revealed its secret not through force but through trust, had defended itself not through violence but through intelligence, and had taught humanity a lesson about the power of cooperation that would ripple outward in ways no one could yet imagine. As darkness fell and the nocturnal shift took over the forest's watch, Lily knew it was time to go home. She stood and hugged Coda goodbye, then Hope, then each of the cubs who were no longer quite cubs anymore. Each embrace was a promise to return, to continue learning, to remain part of this incredible network that connected all living things in the forest. Walking home with her father, Lily looked back once at the tree line. She could no longer see Coda, but she knew the bear was there, watching, protecting, coordinating the endless dance of survival and cooperation that kept the forest safe. And she knew that she would return tomorrow and the day after, and for as many days as the forest would have her. "Do you think other forests have their own Codas?" Lily asked her father as they approached their house, where warm light spilled from the windows and her mother waited with dinner. Ethan considered the question carefully. "I think," he said slowly, "that nature has been keeping secrets from us for a very long time. And maybe, if we're very lucky and very careful, it might share a few more of them with us. That night, Lily fell asleep to the sound of an owl hooting outside her window, but now she heard it differently. It wasn't just a bird calling in the night. It was a sentinel, part of Coda's network, keeping watch while the human world slept. And in that sound was a promise that the forest would endure, would protect itself, would continue to thrive in ways both seen and unseen. The story of Coda and her forest spread in whispers and wondering rather than headlines and scientific papers. It became one of those tales that people weren't quite sure they believed, but couldn't quite dismiss either. Rangers in other forests began paying closer attention to the animals they protected, noticing patterns they'd overlooked, connections they'd dismissed as coincidence. Some reported similar experiences, moments when the wildlife seemed to act with purpose and coordination that suggested something more than instinct. But Lily knew the truth was both simpler and more complex than any story could capture. It wasn't magic or mystery. It was nature being exactly as intelligent and interconnected as it had always been, finally being recognized for what it was rather than what humans had assumed it to be. Coda wasn't supernatural. She was simply a bear who had inherited a responsibility and fulfilled it with a wisdom that transcended species boundaries. As winter approached and the forest prepared for the cold months ahead, changes continued to ripple outward from that small clearing where a girl had met a bear and discovered a world within a world. The local school started a new environmental program with Lily as its youngest advisor, teaching other children to look at nature with new eyes. The ranger station implemented new protocols that worked with natural patterns rather than against them. The veterinary clinic established a wildlife rehabilitation center that seemed to have an uncanny success rate with injured animals. But the biggest change was in the forest itself. Now that its secret was partially known and protected, it seemed to relax in ways subtle but significant. Animals were seen more often during daylight hours. Birds sang louder and longer, and the whole ecosystem seemed to pulse with a vitality that had been hidden before. It was as if the forest was showing gratitude in the only way it knew how, by thriving, by living fully, by being gloriously and completely itself. One snowy morning in December, Lily stood at her usual watching spot, bundled in her warmest coat and sipping hot chocolate her mother had made. The forest was quiet under its blanket of white, but she knew it was still active, still watching, still protecting itself in ways both ancient and evolving. She saw tracks in the snow, Coda's massive paw prints leading from the tree line to a spot just a few feet from where Lily stood. There, placed carefully on a flat stone, was a gift. A perfect pine cone, its scales tipped with frost, arranged with 3 brilliant blue jay feathers and a small piece of honeycomb. Lily understood the message. The forest remembered her, valued her, considered her part of its extended family. She picked up the gifts carefully, treasuring them more than any store-bought present she might receive for the upcoming holidays. Looking up, she saw Coda standing at the forest edge, visible against the snow-covered trees. The bear raised one paw in what had become their greeting, their sign of mutual recognition and respect. Lily raised her hand in return, and for a moment they stood there, bear and girl, connected across species and space by something deeper than words could express. Then Coda turned and walked back into the forest, her form disappearing into the shadows between the trees. But Lily knew she was never really gone, never truly distant. She was part of the forest, and now Lily was too, in a way that would last her entire lifetime. The secret they shared wasn't just about intelligent bears or coordinated wildlife. It was about the fundamental interconnectedness of all living things, the web of relationships that made the forest not just a collection of trees and animals, but a single, breathing, thinking entity. As she walked back to her house, gifts clutched carefully in her mittened hands. Lily thought about the future. She was only 7, but already she knew what she wanted to do with her life. She would become a protector like Coda, a bridge like she already was, someone who could help humans and nature find better ways to coexist. She would study and learn and grow, but she would never forget the lessons the forest had taught her. That intelligence came in many forms, that cooperation was stronger than competition, and that sometimes the best way to protect something was to help it protect itself. The documentary Logan and Michael had created won awards and changed minds, but it was just the beginning. More people came to understand that forests weren't just resources to be managed, but communities to be respected. Laws were changed, protection strengthened, and a new generation began to grow up with a different understanding of humanity's place in the natural world. But in that specific forest, where a bear named Coda continued her ancient work with the help of a growing network of both animal and human allies, the most important changes were the small ones. The poacher who decided to become a wildlife photographer instead. The developer who chose to build elsewhere, rather than disturb an ecosystem he now understood was irreplaceable. The child who saw a bear in the woods and felt wonder rather than fear. Spring came again, as it always did, and with it came new life. Hope had another set of cubs, and Coda began training them as she had trained their older siblings, teaching them the ways of forest protection that had been passed down through generations. Lily watched and learned too, understanding that she was witnessing the continuation of something that had existed long before humans thought to write down their histories. One day, while helping Dr. Chen treat an injured raccoon that had somehow known to come to them for help, Lily asked a question that had been bothering her. "How long do you think this has been going on? The animals protecting the forest this way?" Dr. Chen paused in her work, considering. "I think," she said carefully, "that it's been happening as long as there have been forests to protect. We just forgot how to see it, forgot that we were once part of it too. Maybe what Coda and the others are doing isn't teaching us something new, but reminding us of something we used to know." It was a profound thought, and it stayed with Lily as she grew older. Through elementary school and middle school, through high school and college, she carried the forest's secret with her. She studied biology and ecology, but also indigenous histories and forgotten folklore, finding hints and traces of the truth in stories dismissed as myth. She found references to guardian animals in cultures around the world, to forests that seemed to protect themselves, to times when humans and nature worked together rather than in opposition. By the time she returned home with her doctorate in environmental science, ready to take over from her retiring father as head ranger, the forest had changed again. It was stronger, more vibrant, more alive than ever. The network Coda had maintained had evolved and expanded, including not just animals but the humans who had proven themselves trustworthy. The forest had become a model for conservation efforts worldwide, though few understood the full truth of why it was so successful. Coda was older now, her muzzle gray, her movements slower but still powerful. But she had trained successors, including Hope's oldest daughter, who had shown the same intelligence and leadership abilities. The transition would be smooth when it came, the responsibility passing from one generation to the next as it always had. Standing in the clearing where it had all begun, now officially designated as a protected research site, though no research was actually conducted there, Lily marveled at how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The forest still kept its deepest secrets, still protected itself in ways that science couldn't fully explain. But now it had human allies who understood their role not as masters, but as partners, not as controllers, but as participants in something larger than themselves. A young bear approached her, one of Hope's grandcubs, and did something that would have seemed impossible years ago. It walked up to Lily and gently took her hand in its paw, leading her to where an injured bird lay in the grass. Without hesitation, Lily knelt and examined the bird, determining it had a broken wing that she could splint. The bear watched her work with intelligent eyes, learning, just as she had once learned from Coda. This was the new normal, the evolved relationship between human and forest that had grown from a little girl's courage and a mother bear's wisdom. It wasn't perfect. There were still threats, still those who would harm the forest if they could. But the defense network was stronger than ever, a combination of natural intelligence and human dedication that had proven unbeatable so far. As the sun set on another day in the forest, Lily stood with the latest generation of bears, looking out over the domain they protected together. Somewhere in the trees, birds were settling for the night while passing messages about the day's observations. Somewhere in the underbrush, small mammals were checking the boundaries, ensuring no new threats had appeared. And somewhere in the shadows, Coda watched it all with satisfaction, knowing that her life's work would continue long after she was gone. The forest had always known how to protect itself. It had just needed the right moment, the right child, the right bear, to show humanity that protection didn't mean dominance, and conservation didn't mean control. It meant partnership, understanding, and respect for the intelligence that existed in forms different from, but no less valid than, human consciousness. As Lily walked home that evening, she heard the forest singing its night song, owls and crickets, wind and leaves and water over stones. But underneath it all, she heard something else, something only those who truly belonged could perceive. It was the sound of the network, the constant communication that kept the forest safe, the whisper of intelligence that connected every living thing in these woods. She paused at the forest edge and looked back, seeing shadows moving in ways that suggested purpose rather than randomness. Raising her hand in the gesture Coda had taught her so many years ago, she said good night to the forest and all its guardians, seen and unseen. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats perhaps, but also new opportunities to strengthen the bond between human and nature. The story that had begun with a curious child and a protective bear had become something larger, a blueprint for coexistence, a model for conservation, a hope for a future where humans remembered they were part of nature rather than separate from it. And in the heart of it all, in a forest that thrived under the protection of its own intelligence, the work continued. Coda's legacy wasn't just the forest she protected or the network she maintained. It was the bridge she had helped build between two worlds that had forgotten they were actually one. Through Lily, through the rangers and veterinarians and even reformed poachers who had become allies, she had shown that the divide between human and animal was an illusion, that consciousness and intelligence took many forms, and that cooperation across species boundaries wasn't just possible, but essential. The documentary had called it Nature's Hidden Intelligence, but Lily knew better. There was nothing hidden about it. It had always been there, in plain sight, waiting for humans to remember how to see it. Coda hadn't revealed a secret so much as reminded humanity of a truth it had forgotten in its rush toward civilization and away from its roots in the natural world. Years later, when Lily had children of her own, she would take them to the forest edge and tell them the story, not as a fairy tale or a legend, but as history, as truth, as an ongoing reality they were part of. She would introduce them to the latest generation of guardian bears, to the birds that carried messages, to the deer that created distractions, to the whole incredible network that kept their forest safe. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist hung low between the trees, she would see a familiar shape at the forest edge. Coda, ancient now but still magnificent, would emerge just long enough to check on the human who had become her most trusted ally. They would share that same gesture, paw to heart, hand to heart, that had sealed their partnership so many years before. The forest's secret was no longer completely secret, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was that it was protected, respected, and allowed to continue its ancient work. What mattered was that humans had remembered they could be partners rather than conquerors, students rather than masters, part of the network rather than outside it. And in forests around the world, other codas were being discovered, other networks revealed, other partnerships formed. The revolution was quiet, happening in clearings and ranger stations rather than capitals and boardrooms. But it was real, and it was spreading. Humanity was relearning what it meant to be part of nature rather than apart from it. And the teachers were bears and birds, foxes and deer, and one small girl who had been brave enough to follow a bear into the woods and discover a truth that changed everything.